The rain hit Deadwood like a fist, and Zelda Sutherland's umbrella inverted with a crack that sounded like a gunshot, spilling muddy water across the ledgers cradled against her chest. Ink bled immediately into the pages, numbers dissolving into black rivers that spread across columns. She had spent 3 days copying by candlelight before leaving St. Louis. She stood in the middle of the rutted street, stagecoach already pulling away, watching her father's entire accounting history turn to indecipherable soup while the storm hammered down. A horse stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell wet leather and cattle. The rider swung down without a word, shrugged out of a long oilskin coat and draped it over her shoulders and the ruined ledgers in one smooth motion. He was drenched within seconds, dark hair plastered to his forehead, but his expression remained calm, almost amused. "Get those under cover," he said, tucking the coat more firmly around the books. "Might save some of it." Zelda clutched the coat closed, suddenly aware that her traveling dress was soaked through and her boots were sinking into mud. "I need to get to the freight office. Sutherland and Company." "That is 2 blocks down and 1 over," the man said. He took his horse's reins and began walking, leading the animal at a pace that matched her stumbling gait. Rain poured off the brim of his hat in sheets. "I know the place." She hurried alongside him, trying to keep the ledgers dry beneath the coat, acutely conscious that this stranger was getting soaked on her behalf. Water streamed down his face, darkened his shirt until it clung to his shoulders, but he walked as though the weather were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. When she tried to return the coat, he shook his head. "You are carrying something worth saving," he said. "I am just getting wet." The freight office appeared through the rain like a ghost, its painted sign so faded she could barely read her father's name. The building leaned slightly, its porch sagging, and the windows were dark. Zelda felt her stomach drop. She had known things were bad. The letters from her father's partner had made that clear. But seeing the office in person, rain dripping through gaps in the roof, made the reality settle like a stone. The cowboy tied his horse to the rail and tried the door. It opened with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing a dim interior that smelled of mildew and old paper. He stepped back, gesturing her inside. "Thank you," Zelda said, meaning it. She started to slip out of the coat, but he waved her off. "Keep it until you get those books somewhere dry," he said. "I will come by later to collect it." "I do not even know your name," he smiled then, the first real warmth breaking through. "Caleb Garrett, I buy cattle. You must be Sutherland's daughter." "Zelda," she said. "How did you know? You look like him," Caleb said simply. Same stubborn set to the jaw. He was a good man. "I am sorry for your loss." The words were plain but sincere, and Zelda found herself blinking back sudden tears. She had been traveling for 2 weeks, ever since the telegram arrived saying her father had died of pneumonia. There had been no time to grieve, only to pack what she could carry and board the first westbound stage. Now, standing in the wreckage of his life's work, the weight of it threatened to crush her. "Thank you," she said again, because there was nothing else to say. Caleb touched the brim of his hat and walked back into the rain, leading his horse toward what she assumed were the livery stables. Zelda watched him go, then turned to face the office. Inside, chaos reigned. Papers lay scattered across every surface, some water-damaged, others torn. The desk her father had built with his own hands was buried under ledgers, bills of lading, and correspondence. Crates were stacked haphazardly against the walls, some opened and half empty, others sealed and gathering dust. A pot-bellied stove sat cold in the corner, its chimney pipe hanging at an angle that suggested it had not worked in months. Zelda set the ruined ledgers on the least cluttered corner of the desk and began to assess the damage. The ink had bled badly, but some entries were still legible. She would have to reconstruct what she could from the invoices and receipts scattered throughout the office. It would take days, maybe weeks, but it was the only way to understand how deep the trouble ran. She was still standing there, water dripping from her dress onto the floor, when a knock sounded at the door. A man entered without waiting for an answer, tall and hollow-cheeked, dressed in a suit that had seen better days. He looked at her with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and predatory. "Miss Sutherland," he said, "I am Monroe Fletcher, your father's partner. I did not expect you until tomorrow." "The stage came early," Zelda said. She did not offer her hand. Something about Fletcher made her skin crawl, though she could not have said exactly what. "I am afraid you have arrived at a difficult time," Fletcher continued, moving into the room as though he owned it. "Your father's debts are considerable. The mortgage is 3 months overdue and the bank is threatening foreclosure." "I have the ledgers," Zelda said, gesturing to the soggy books. "I will review the accounts and determine exactly where we stand." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. "That will not be necessary. I have already prepared a complete accounting. The situation is quite clear. The best course of action is to liquidate the remaining assets and close the business. I have a buyer interested in the property." "I am sure you do," Zelda said, her voice cold. "But I will review the books myself before making any decisions. This was my father's company. I owe it to him to understand what happened." "Your father was a dreamer, Miss Sutherland. He made poor investments, extended credit to unreliable customers, and refused to adapt to changing markets. I tried to guide him, but he would not listen." Zelda met his gaze without flinching. "Then it is fortunate I am here now to make my own assessment. Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Fletcher. I will contact you when I have completed my review." Fletcher's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and left, closing the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Zelda waited until his footsteps faded before allowing herself to breathe. She had made an enemy, but she did not care. Something about Fletcher's eagerness to sell made her deeply suspicious. She spent the rest of the afternoon clearing space and organizing papers. The rain continued to pound against the roof, finding every weak spot and dripping into strategically placed buckets. By the time darkness fell, she had managed to create a small area of relative order around the desk. Her dress had dried into stiff, uncomfortable wrinkles, but at least she was no longer dripping. A soft knock interrupted her work. She opened the door to find Caleb Garrett standing on the porch, still damp but now wearing a clean shirt. He held a covered basket that smelled like heaven. "Thought you might not have eaten," he said. "Mrs. Chen at the boarding house sent fried chicken and biscuits. She remembers your father fondly." Zelda's stomach growled loudly enough to make them both smile. She had not eaten since a hurried breakfast at the last stage stop, and the smell of food made her suddenly dizzy with hunger. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "Please, you have been more than kind." Caleb set the basket on the desk and retrieved his coat from the hook where she had hung it to dry. "How bad is it?" "I do not know yet," Zelda admitted. "The records are a mess. My father's partner claims the debts are insurmountable, but I do not trust him." "Fletcher," Caleb said, and it was not a question. "He has been circling this place like a vulture since your father took ill. You are right not to trust him. You know him. Everyone knows him. He came to Deadwood 2 years ago with money and big plans. Bought into several businesses, always as the silent partner, always with terms that favored him when things went south. Your father was not the first man to regret partnering with Monroe Fletcher." Zelda felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp clothing. "What should I do?" "Get a lawyer," Caleb said immediately. "Have someone review the partnership agreement and the mortgage terms. Fletcher is slippery, but he is not invincible. If there is a way out, a good lawyer will find it. I cannot afford a lawyer, Zelda said quietly. I used most of my savings for the stage fare. Caleb was silent for a moment, studying her face. Then he nodded as though reaching a decision. Eat first. Everything is easier on a full stomach. We can worry about lawyers tomorrow. He left before she could thank him again, and Zelda found herself alone with a basket of still warm food and a growing list of problems. But as she bit into the best fried chicken she had ever tasted, she felt a spark of something that might have been hope. She was not entirely alone in this strange town. At least one person seemed willing to help. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The storm washed away as though it had never been. Zelda woke on a cot in the back room of the office, stiff and sore but determined. She had spent half the night going through papers, and while the picture remained incomplete, certain patterns were beginning to emerge. Her father had not been a poor businessman. In fact, many of his decisions showed real insight. But someone had been bleeding the company dry through a series of small, nearly invisible transactions that added up to a devastating loss. She was cross-referencing invoices when Caleb appeared at the door, leading his horse. The animal was loaded with saddlebags that bulged promisingly. "Thought you might need supplies," he said. "Coffee, bread, cheese, some dried apples. Mrs. Chen added a jar of her pickles. She says they are good for thinking." "You have already done too much," Zelda protested, even as she accepted the bags gratefully. "Not even close," Caleb said cheerfully. "Besides, I have an ulterior motive. I need your help." Zelda raised an eyebrow. "My help? I am barely keeping my head above water here." "You know numbers," Caleb said. "I am good with cattle, decent with people, terrible with bookkeeping. My accounts are a disaster and I need to sort them out before I lose track of where my money went. I will pay you for your time." "I cannot take your money," Zelda said automatically. "Why not? You would be working for it. I need a bookkeeper, you need income. Seems like a fair trade to me." Put that way, it was hard to argue. Zelda hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but I can only spare a few hours a day until I get my father's affairs in order." "That is all I am asking," Caleb said. He looked genuinely relieved, which surprised her. She had assumed he was inventing the problem to give her an excuse to accept help, but his expression suggested the need was real. They spent the morning working side by side, Zelda sorting through her father's records, while Caleb brought in his own ledgers from the saddlebags. His books were, as promised, a complete mess. Receipts were stuffed between pages, notes were scrawled in margins, an entire month seemed to be missing. But as she began to untangle the chaos, a picture emerged of a man who worked hard, dealt fairly, and was slowly sinking despite doing everything right. "You bought 1,000 head in the spring," she said, tracing an entry. "Where are they now?" Caleb's expression darkened. "Stranded on the other side of the quarantine line. Texas fever came through Montana, and the territorial government closed the border. Nobody can move cattle across until the all-clear is given, and there is no telling when that will be." "How long have they been waiting?" 3 months. "I am paying for grazing and water, hiring men to watch them, losing weight and value every day they stand still. I sunk everything I had into that herd. If I cannot get them to market soon, I will be ruined." Zelda studied the numbers, her mind already working through possibilities. "What if you sell locally? The army forts must need beef. The mining camps certainly do." "Prices are half what I would get in Chicago or St. Louis," Caleb said. "I would barely break even, assuming I could find enough buyers." "Breaking even is better than going broke," Zelda pointed out. "And if you can hold on until the quarantine lifts, you can rebuild." Caleb looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You sound like your father. He always said surviving was the first step to succeeding. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. She returned her attention to the ledgers, but she was acutely aware of Caleb working across from her, his presence solid and reassuring in a way that made the overwhelming task ahead feel slightly less impossible. They worked through the afternoon, breaking only when Caleb insisted on buying her lunch from the Chinese restaurant down the street. The food was good and cheap, and they ate at the desk, comparing notes between bites. Zelda found herself relaxing in his company. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and often funny. He had a way of finding humor in difficult situations without making light of them, a balance she appreciated. By evening, she had completed a preliminary accounting of both businesses. The news was not good. Her father's company owed $3,000 to the bank, with another $2,000 in outstanding debts to suppliers and creditors. Caleb's situation was equally dire. He had $800 in operating capital and monthly expenses that would drain it completely in less than 6 weeks. Neither of them could afford a misstep. "We are a pair, are we not?" Caleb said wryly, studying the numbers she had written out. "A pair of fools, perhaps," Zelda said, but she smiled as she said it. "What are we going to do?" "Keep swimming," Caleb said. "It is the only option besides drowning." The words were grim, but his tone was not. He seemed genuinely unconcerned about the disaster looming over him, and Zelda could not decide if that made him brave or reckless. Probably both. Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Mornings were spent on separate tasks. Zelda worked through her father's accounts while Caleb rode out to meet with potential buyers for his stranded cattle. Afternoons they shared, Zelda reorganizing Caleb's books while he wrote letters and negotiated deals. Evenings, they compared notes, strategizing and planning. It was during one of these evening sessions that Zelda finally confronted the extent of Fletcher's betrayal. She had been cross-referencing invoices against bank deposits when she noticed a pattern. Payments that should have gone to suppliers were instead being funneled to a holding account controlled by Fletcher. He had been embezzling systematically, small amounts that her father might not notice immediately, but that added up to nearly $1,000 over 18 months. "That bastard," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "He was robbing my father blind." Caleb leaned over to study the evidence she had compiled. His expression went hard. "This is fraud. You could have him arrested." "I would need to prove it in court," Zelda said. "That means lawyers and time I do not have. The bank will foreclose long before any case makes it to trial." "So we prove it faster," Caleb said. "I know a federal marshal who owes me a favor. He is honest and he hates men who cheat widows and orphans. If we show him this, he will investigate." "My father was not a widow or an orphan," Zelda pointed out, but she was already gathering the relevant documents. "Near enough," Caleb said. "Come on. We need to catch Marshal Davis before he leaves on his circuit." They found the marshal at the saloon, nursing a beer and playing a desultory game of cards. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness that made him both respected and feared. When Caleb explained the situation, Davis set down his cards and studied the documents Zelda spread across the table. "This is good work," he said after a long silence. "Clear, methodical, damning. Fletcher is smart but not smart enough to cover these tracks. I will bring him in for questioning tomorrow." "What about my father's company?" Zelda asked. "Can this evidence delay the foreclosure?" Davis considered. "Possibly. If Fletcher defrauded your father, the bank might be willing to extend the mortgage while the legal matters are settled." "No guarantees, but it is worth trying. You should speak to the bank manager directly, show him what you found." Zelda felt a surge of hope, so intense it was almost painful. Thank you, Marshal. I cannot tell you what this means. Save your thanks until we see what comes of it, Davis said, but he smiled as he said it. Your father was a decent man. I am glad to help his daughter. Walking back to the freight office, Zelda found herself trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. For the first time since arriving in Deadwood, she felt like she might actually succeed. The path forward was still treacherous, but at least it existed. Caleb walked beside her, his presence steady and calming. When they reached the office, he paused at the door. You did well today, he said. Your father would be proud. The words broke something loose inside her. Zelda felt tears prick her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. I miss him. I know that is foolish. I barely knew him as an adult, but I miss him. That is not foolish, Caleb said gently. That is human. She looked up at him. This man who had given her his coat in a rainstorm, who had helped her without asking for anything in return, who made her laugh even when everything seemed hopeless. He was looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and complicated that made her heart beat faster. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. You do not need to keep thanking me, Caleb said. We are friends. Friends help each other. Friends. The word should have been comforting, but instead it left her feeling oddly disappointed. She pushed the feeling aside and smiled. Then, as your friend, I should tell you that your handwriting is atrocious, and you need to start using proper columns in your ledgers. Caleb laughed, the sound bright in the gathering dark. I will take it under advisement. Good night, Zelda. Good night, Caleb. She watched him walk away, then went inside and closed the door. The office felt emptier than it had before, and she found herself wishing he had stayed longer. But there was work to do, always work to do, and she lost herself in numbers until her eyes grew too heavy to focus. The next morning brought news both good and bad. Marshal Davis had arrested Monroe Fletcher on suspicion of fraud, and the evidence Zelda provided was strong enough that the judge had denied bail. That was the good news. The bad news came from the bank manager, a nervous man named Whitmore who seemed genuinely distressed by the situation. I sympathize with your position, Miss Sutherland, he said, fidgeting with his pen. But the bank has its own obligations to consider. The mortgage is severely delinquent, and while Fletcher's alleged crimes are troubling, they do not change the fact that the debt exists and must be paid. I understand, Zelda said, keeping her voice calm though her hands were clenched in her lap. I am asking for an extension, not forgiveness. Give me 3 months to sort out the estate and recover what Fletcher stole. If I cannot make significant progress by then, I will liquidate the assets myself and pay what I can. Whitmore studied her for a long moment. Your father was a valued customer for many years. Against my better judgment, I am willing to grant a 60-day extension. Not 3 months, 60 days. After that, if the debt is not substantially reduced, I will have no choice but to foreclose. 60 days. It was not enough, but it was more than she had. Zelda stood and offered her hand. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I will not waste the time you have given me. She left the bank feeling both relieved and terrified. 60 days to solve a problem that had taken years to create. It seemed impossible, but she had no choice except to try. Caleb was waiting outside, leaning against a post with his hat tipped back. When he saw her expression, he straightened. How did it go? 60 days, Zelda said. I have 60 days to save my father's company. Then we had better get started, Caleb said. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They spent the afternoon visiting merchants and suppliers, Caleb vouching for her while she negotiated new terms on old debts. His reputation carried weight in Deadwood, and more than one creditor agreed to extend payment deadlines or reduce interest rates based solely on his word. By evening, she had managed to restructure nearly half the outstanding obligations, buying herself breathing room she desperately needed. "I do not know how to repay you," she said as they walked back toward the freight office. "You are repaying me," Caleb said. "My books have never looked better. I actually know where my money is going now. That is worth more than you realize." "Still," Zelda said, but she let the thought trail off. She was learning that Caleb did not accept gratitude easily, that he deflected thanks with humor or by minimizing his own contributions. It was both endearing and frustrating. That evening she invited him to stay for dinner. She had learned to use the ancient stove, and while her cooking skills were limited, she could manage a passable stew. They ate at the desk, talking about everything and nothing. Caleb told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, learning the cattle trade from his father before striking out on his own. Zelda shared stories of St. Louis, of her work as a bookkeeper for a shipping company, of her decision to come west when her father's letters stopped arriving. "Were you close?" Caleb asked. "You and your father." "When I was young, yes," Zelda said. "He used to take me to his office, let me play with the typewriter and pretend I was running the business. But after my mother died, he could not stay in St. Louis. Too many memories. He came west looking for a fresh start, and I stayed behind with my aunt. We wrote letters, but it was not the same." "That must have been hard," Caleb said quietly. "It was," Zelda admitted. "I understood why he left, but part of me always felt abandoned. Coming here, seeing what he built, it helps somehow. I feel closer to him now than I did when he was alive." Caleb reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. The gesture was simple, almost brotherly, but it sent warmth flooding through her. When he pulled back, she found herself missing the contact. The days blurred together after that, a relentless cycle of work and worry punctuated by moments of unexpected joy. Caleb was a constant presence, helping where he could, offering support when he could not. They worked well together, falling into an easy partnership that felt both natural and profound. Zelda found herself looking forward to his arrivals, disappointed when he had to leave. She told herself it was just because he was helpful, because he made the overwhelming task ahead seem manageable. But late at night, alone in the office, she admitted the truth. She was falling for him, hard and fast and completely. The realization terrified her. She had come to Deadwood to save her father's legacy, not to find romance. And even if she wanted to pursue something with Caleb, what could she offer him? She was broke, buried in debt, and likely to lose everything in a matter of weeks. He deserved better than a woman with nothing but problems and fading hopes. But knowing she should not feel this way did not stop her heart from racing when he smiled at her, did not prevent her breath from catching when their hands accidentally brushed. She was falling, and she had no idea if he felt even a fraction of the same. 3 weeks into her 60-day deadline, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Heavy rains returned to the Black Hills, and the creeks and rivers began to rise. At first it seemed manageable, an inconvenience but not a catastrophe. Then the Belle Fourche River broke its banks, flooding the valley and washing out the bridge at the main crossing. The news reached Deadwood in the form of a sodden rider who collapsed in the street, gasping that the freight road was impassable and would remain so for weeks, possibly months. Zelda felt her stomach drop. Every remaining asset of her father's company depended on a shipment of mining equipment scheduled to arrive from Cheyenne. The buyer had already paid a deposit, and if she could not deliver, she would have to refund the money she had already spent on debt reduction. The loss would be catastrophic, probably fatal. Caleb found her sitting on the steps of the office, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without a word, his shoulder warm against hers. "The shipment," she said finally. "It cannot cross." Even if it makes it to the river, there is no way to ford it. The buyer will cancel the contract, demand his deposit back. I will be ruined. The buyer is the Golden Star Mine, Caleb said. I know the foreman. He is a decent man. He will work with you if you explain the situation. What is there to explain? I promised delivery and I cannot deliver. He has every right to cancel and take his money back. Caleb was quiet for a moment, staring out at the muddy street. Then he said, What if we combine our problems? Zelda looked at him, confused. What do you mean? Your shipment is stuck. My cattle are stuck. Both of us need to move goods that cannot be moved through normal channels. What if we find an alternative route? There is no alternative route, Zelda said. The Belle Fourche crossing is the only way through for 100 miles in either direction. The only wagon route, Caleb agreed. But there are other ways to move freight. Pack mules can go places wagons cannot. If we could get the shipment to the river, we could ferry it across piece by piece, then repack it on the other side. It would be slow and expensive, but it would work. And your cattle? Same principle, different application. I cannot bring 1,000 head across a flooded river, but I can sell them locally for less than I hoped and use the proceeds to buy new stock once the quarantine lifts. It is not ideal, but it keeps me in business. Zelda turned the idea over in her mind, looking for flaws. There were plenty. The plan was risky, expensive, and dependent on factors outside their control, but it was also the only option that did not end in total failure. We would need capital, she said slowly. Money for mules, ferries, labor. I do not have it. I do, Caleb said. Barely. If I sell the cattle at local prices, I will clear enough to fund the operation with a little left over for operating expenses. We pool our resources, solve both problems, and come out the other side intact. If it works, Zelda said. If it works, Caleb agreed. But doing nothing guarantees failure. At least this gives us a chance. She looked at him, this man who had already risked so much to help her, now proposing to stake his entire future on a desperate gamble. Why are you doing this? You could cut your losses, sell the cattle, and walk away with enough to start over somewhere else. Why tie yourself to my sinking ship? Caleb met her gaze steadily. Because I do not want to start over somewhere else. I like it here. I like the work, the people. I like you. He said the last part simply, without drama or artifice, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Zelda felt her heart stutter. Caleb, you do not have to say anything, he interrupted gently. I am not asking for promises or declarations. I am just telling you why I am willing to take the risk. We are in this together, whether you planned it that way or not. Might as well make the most of it. She wanted to kiss him. The urge was sudden and overwhelming, and it took all her self-control to remain seated, hands folded in her lap. Instead she said, All right, let us do it. Let us save both our businesses or go down trying. Caleb grinned, the expression bright enough to rival the sun. Now you are talking. Come on. We have plans to make and very little time to make them. The next week was a blur of frantic activity. Caleb sold his cattle to a consortium of local buyers for 60 cents on the dollar, a loss that made Zelda wince, but that gave them the capital they needed. She coordinated with the freight company holding her shipment, arranging for it to be broken down into smaller loads suitable for pack mules. Caleb hired a crew of experienced muleteers and negotiated ferry rights with a homesteader who lived near the flooded river. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, and more than once Zelda wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. But Caleb remained unshakably confident, his good humor infectious even in the darkest moments. When the crew balked at the danger of crossing a swollen river, he talked them through it with patience and respect. When the ferry owner tried to triple his price at the last minute, Caleb negotiated him back down with a combination of charm and veiled threats. He was, Zelda realized, very good at his job. The affable exterior hid a sharp mind and an iron will. She found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his hands moved when he talked, the crinkle at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. He caught her staring more than once, and each time his smile grew a little warmer, a little more knowing. The tension between them was palpable, a living thing that crackled in the air whenever they were alone. But neither of them acted on it. There was too much at stake, too much work to be done. The day the pack train left for the river, Zelda insisted on going along. Caleb argued briefly, citing the danger and discomfort, but he gave in when he saw her determination. They rode out at dawn, leading a string of 20 mules loaded with mining equipment. The trail was rough, made worse by the recent rains, and progress was slow. But the weather held, and by late afternoon they reached the river. The Bell Forge was a monster, swollen to 3 times its normal width and moving fast enough to carry whole trees in its current. The makeshift ferry looked pathetically small against the churning water, and Zelda felt her confidence waver. "Are you certain this is safe?" she asked. "Safe enough," Caleb said, though his expression was serious. "The ferry operator knows what he is doing. We take it slow, one load at a time, and we will be fine." The crossing took 2 full days. Each trip was an exercise in controlled terror, the ferry rocking and swaying while the river tried its best to sweep them away. Zelda helped where she could, hauling ropes and steadying nervous mules, but mostly she watched and worried. Caleb was everywhere at once, coordinating the crew, checking loads, reassuring the animals. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before, and gradually Zelda allowed herself to believe they might actually pull it off. On the second evening, with the last load safely across, they made camp on the far bank. The crew settled around a fire, swapping stories and passing a bottle of whiskey. Zelda sat slightly apart, too exhausted to join in, and watched the river flow past in the gathering darkness. Caleb dropped down beside her, offering a tin cup of coffee. She accepted it gratefully, warming her hands on the metal. "We did it," he said quietly. "The hard part is over." "The hard part," Zelda repeated. "You mean there is more, always," Caleb said, grinning. "But we will handle it the same way we handled this, one step at a time." She looked at him, silhouetted against the firelight, and felt something shift inside her. This was not just gratitude or admiration. This was something deeper, something that scared and exhilarated her in equal measure. She was in love with him, completely, irrevocably in love. "Caleb," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. He turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too," her breath caught. "You do. From the moment I saw you standing in the rain, soaked and stubborn and refusing to give up. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met. I still do." "I am not brave," Zelda said. "I am terrified most of the time." "Being brave does not mean you are not scared," Caleb said. "It means you do what needs doing anyway. You amaze me, Zelda. Every single day you amaze me." She set down the coffee cup and reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "I think we are falling in love," Caleb said. "Unless I am completely misreading the situation, in which case this is about to get very awkward." Zelda laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "You are not misreading it. I am falling too. I have been falling since you gave me your coat and walked in the rain." "Good," Caleb said. He leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Because I would very much like to kiss you now, if that is all right." "That is more than all right," Zelda said, and closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft and sweet, tentative at first and then growing bolder. Caleb tasted like coffee and hope, and Zelda felt something inside her settle and sing at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Well," Caleb said, "that was worth waiting for." "We should probably get back to work," Zelda said, though she made no move to let go of his hand. "Probably," Caleb agreed, "but maybe we can take a minute first. Just sit here and enjoy the fact that we are both still alive and slightly less broke than we were a week ago." "When you put it that way, it sounds almost romantic," Zelda teased. "I am very romantic," Caleb said seriously. "I once gave a woman my coat in a rainstorm." Zelda laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down and listening to the river rush past. It was not a perfect moment. They were still dirty and exhausted, still facing enormous challenges with limited resources. But it was theirs, and that made it precious. The trip back to Deadwood took 3 more days. By the time they arrived, Zelda was sunburned, saddle sore, and happier than she had been in months. The shipment was delivered on schedule. The Golden Star mine foreman was delighted, and the payment cleared every remaining debt her father's company owed. For the first time since arriving in Dakota Territory, Zelda went to sleep without the weight of impending disaster crushing her chest. She woke to find Caleb already at work, reorganizing the warehouse and making plans for future shipments. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was bright enough to light the room. "Good morning," he said. "I made coffee. It is terrible, but it is hot." "I will take it," Zelda said. She accepted the cup and sat down at the desk, studying the notes he had been making. "What is all this?" "Ideas," Caleb said. "Your father's freight business has good bones, but it needs to expand. The mines are growing, the town is growing, and there is money to be made if we are smart about it. I was thinking we could combine our operations. Use your freight connections to move cattle and beef to market. Use my livestock expertise to negotiate better deals. We would be stronger together than separate." "We," Zelda repeated softly. "You want to go into business together." "I want a lot of things together," Caleb said. He set down his pen and came around the desk to stand in front of her. "But yes, business is a good place to start. What do you think?" Zelda thought about it, turning the idea over from every angle. It made sense financially. Their skills complemented each other, and their combined resources would give them stability neither could achieve alone. But it was more than that. Working with Caleb felt right in a way that went beyond profit margins and shipping schedules. "I think it is a good idea," she said finally. "But we should make it official. A real partnership with legal contracts and everything." "Agreed," Caleb said. "We can go see a lawyer this afternoon, make it all proper and binding." They shook on it, and then, because it seemed natural and inevitable, they kissed. This time there was no hesitation, no question. They fit together perfectly, and when they finally pulled apart, Zelda was breathless. "We should probably tell people," she said. "About the business partnership, I mean." "And the other partnership?" Caleb asked, raising an eyebrow. "That too," Zelda said, blushing. "If you want to." "I want to," Caleb said firmly. "I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours, assuming that is what you want too." "It is," Zelda said. "Definitely." The next few months passed in a golden haze of work and happiness. They formalized their business partnership, merging Sutherland Freight with Garrett Livestock to create a new company they simply called Sutherland and Garrett. The name felt right, a symbol of their equal partnership and shared future. Fletcher's trial concluded with a conviction and a sentence of 5 years in federal prison, and the money he had stolen was recovered and returned to the estate. With those funds, they were able to pay off the remaining mortgage and invest in expanding the business. The quarantine line lifted in early autumn, and Caleb immediately began rebuilding his herd. Zelda handled the logistics, coordinating shipments and negotiating contracts with a skill that earned her respect throughout the territory. They made a formidable team, and their success was noticed. Within 6 months, Sutherland and Garrett had become one of the most reliable freight and livestock operations in the Black Hills. But it was not all work. Caleb courted her properly, with flowers and dinners and long walks through the hills above town. He was romantic in quiet, understated ways, leaving her notes tucked into ledgers or bringing her coffee exactly the way she liked it. Zelda found herself falling deeper in love with him every day, charmed by his kindness and steadiness, by the way he made her laugh even when she was exhausted. 6 months after they met, on a crisp spring evening, Caleb took her to the spot where they had first crossed the Belle Forge. The river was calm now, a gentle flow that bore no resemblance to the monster that had nearly defeated them. They sat on the bank, watching the sun set, and Caleb took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the future, our future." "Have you now?" Zelda said, smiling. "I have," Caleb said seriously. "I know we have not known each other very long. But I also know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building something together, making a home and a family. And I know I do not want to wait any longer to ask you to be my wife." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "It is not much," he said, "but it is honest like us. Will you marry me, Zelda Sutherland?" Tears blurred Zelda's vision, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger and they kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was perfect, and Zelda thought that if her father could see her now, he would be happy. She had saved his legacy and found her own happiness in the process. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Deadwood. Mrs. Chen provided the food, Marshall Davis gave Zelda away, and half the town turned out to celebrate. It was joyful and chaotic, and exactly what they both wanted. Afterward, they returned to the house they had bought together, a modest but comfortable place on the edge of town with room to grow. The first year of marriage was an adventure. They worked hard, expanding the business and establishing themselves as pillars of the community. Zelda joined the local school board, advocating for better education for the children of miners and ranchers. Caleb became known for his fair dealing and willingness to help neighbors in need. Together, they built a life that was rich in purpose and love. In the spring of 1880, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They had talked about children in abstract terms, but the reality of a baby was suddenly very real and immediate. Caleb became absurdly protective, fussing over Zelda's health and trying to take over all her tasks. She tolerated it for about a week before sitting him down and firmly explaining that she was pregnant, not fragile, and perfectly capable of continuing to work. Their daughter was born in December, a tiny, fierce thing with Zelda's dark hair and Caleb's blue eyes. They named her Dorothy, and she became the center of their world. Caleb was a natural father, patient and gentle, and watching him with their daughter made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. Dorothy was barely a year old when Zelda discovered she was pregnant again. This time it was a boy, born in the autumn of 1882. They named him Daniel, and he was the opposite of his sister in every way, calm where she was tempestuous, quiet where she was loud. Together, the children filled the house with laughter and chaos, and Zelda could not imagine her life any other way. The business continued to thrive. By 1885, Sutherland and Garrett had expanded to include warehouses in 3 towns and contracts with most of the major mines and ranches in the region. They employed over 20 people, and their reputation for reliability and honesty was unmatched. But success did not change them. They still worked side by side, still consulted each other on every major decision, still treated their partnership as the foundation of everything they built. When Dorothy was 5 and Daniel was 3, Zelda discovered she was pregnant for a 3rd time. She was older now, 32, and the pregnancy was harder than the first 2. Caleb worried constantly, but Zelda was determined to see it through. Their 3rd child, a daughter they named Eliza, was born small and fragile but healthy. She had Caleb's smile and a temperament that fell somewhere between her siblings, neither as wild as Dorothy nor as quiet as Daniel. With 3 children and a thriving business, life was full to bursting. There were school programs and business meetings, family dinners and community events. Zelda and Caleb navigated it all together, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the victories. They fought sometimes, usually about small things like whose turn it was to deal with a difficult client or whether Dorothy was old enough to ride a horse alone. But the fights never lasted long. They had learned early that life was too short to waste on petty disagreements. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the ledgers were balanced, they would sit together on the porch and watch the stars. Caleb would tell stories about his day, and Zelda would share hers, and they would plan for the future. They talked about expanding into new markets, about building a proper school for the town, about taking the children to visit St. Louis, so Zelda could show them where she grew up. But mostly they just sat together, content in each other's company, grateful for the life they had built from nothing but stubbornness and hope. On a warm summer evening in 1890, 15 years after they met, Zelda and Caleb sat on the porch of their home and watched their children play in the yard. Dorothy was 14 now, tall and strong, and already talking about going to college. Daniel was 12, quiet and thoughtful, with a talent for numbers that made him his mother's favorite assistant. Eliza was 8, bright and curious, with a fearlessness that terrified and delighted her parents in equal measure. "We did all right," Caleb said, reaching for Zelda's hand. "We did better than all right," Zelda said, lacing her fingers through his. "We did wonderfully." "Remember when we met?" Caleb asked. "You were standing in the rain with that ridiculous umbrella, looking like you wanted to murder someone." "I wanted to murder you for a minute," Zelda admitted. "Walking in the rain like it was nothing, grinning like a fool." "I was a fool," Caleb said. "Foolish enough to fall in love with a woman I had just met, foolish enough to stake everything on a wild gamble, best foolish decisions I ever made." Zelda leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "I would do it all again," she said softly. "Every hard moment, every sleepless night, every terrifying risk. I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." "Me too," Caleb said. He kissed the top of her head, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and counting their blessings. The business continued to grow over the years. By the turn of the century, Sutherland and Garrett had become one of the largest freight and livestock operations in the Dakota Territory. They had weathered droughts and economic panics, labor disputes and natural disasters, and emerged stronger each time. Their success was built on hard work and fair dealing, on a partnership that was as solid in business as it was in marriage. Dorothy went east to college, studying business and economics, and returned with ideas that modernized the company and increased its profitability. Daniel took over the livestock side of the operation, bringing the same thoughtful approach to cattle that his mother brought to bookkeeping. Eliza surprised everyone by becoming a lawyer, The first woman admitted to the territorial bar, and she used her skills to protect the family business and advocate for workers' rights. Caleb and Zelda gradually stepped back from daily operations, content to let their children run the business they had built. They traveled a little, visiting old friends and exploring places they had only read about. But they always came back to Deadwood, to the home they had made together, to the community they had helped build. In 1910, Caleb fell ill with pneumonia. Zelda nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside day and night, just as he had once sat by hers when she had been sick years before. He recovered, but the illness aged him, and both of them knew their time was growing short. They made the most of the years they had left, filling them with family gatherings and quiet moments together. They celebrated the births of grandchildren, attended weddings and graduations, and watched with pride as their children and grandchildren carried on the legacy they had started. On a spring morning in 1915, Zelda woke to find Caleb watching her, his expression tender. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The rain," he said. "I was thinking about the day we met. You looked so fierce, standing there with your ruined umbrella and your bleeding ledgers. I knew right then that you were someone special." "You gave me your coat," Zelda said, smiling at the memory. "Walked in the rain like it was nothing." "It was nothing," Caleb said. "Compared to what I gained, a little rain was the easiest sacrifice in the world." Zelda reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades of practice. "We had a good life, did we not?" "The best," Caleb said. "The very best." They lay together, watching the morning sun paint patterns on the wall, and Zelda thought about everything they had shared. The struggles and triumphs, the children and grandchildren, the business they had built from nothing. It had been a life filled with love and purpose, and she would not change a single moment. Caleb died peacefully in his sleep 2 years later at the age of 73. Zelda held his hand as he passed, whispering her love and gratitude, promising to join him soon. The funeral was the largest Deadwood had ever seen, a testament to the respect and affection the community felt for the man who had helped so many over the years. Zelda lived another 5 years, long enough to see the business transition fully to the next generation, long enough to hold her first great-grandchild. She spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories about the old days and dispensing wisdom earned through hard experience. When she died at 78, she was laid to rest beside Caleb, their graves marked by a simple stone that read, "Together in life and death." The business they founded continued for generations, adapting to changing times, but always maintaining the principles of honesty and hard work that Caleb and Zelda had established. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren. The umbrella in the storm, the coat given freely, the partnership that became a love story. Dorothy, Daniel, and Eliza ensured their parents' legacy lived on not just in the business but in the community. They funded schools and libraries, supported hospitals and orphanages, and used their wealth to make life better for those who came after them. It was what their parents would have wanted, and they pursued it with the same determination that had characterized everything Caleb and Zelda did. In the end, the story of Zelda and Caleb was not just a love story, though it was certainly that. It was a story about resilience and partnership, about building something lasting from the ruins of loss. It was about two people who met in a storm and chose to face every storm after that together. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in Deadwood, still run the business that bears their names. The old freight office has been preserved as a museum, the ledgers that Zelda once rescued from the rain carefully displayed behind glass. Visitors can see the desk where they worked side by side, the stove where Zelda learned to cook, the place where two people fell in love and changed the course of countless lives. And sometimes, on rainy days, people swear they can see two figures walking down the street, a tall man in a dripping shirt and a determined woman clutching a ruined umbrella, both of them smiling as though they know a wonderful secret. It is just a story, of course, the kind of romantic tale that grows around beloved figures. But in a town built on hope and hard work, on the belief that ordinary people can build extraordinary lives, the story fits, because in the end, that is exactly what Zelda and Caleb did. They took a moment of kindness in a rainstorm and turned it into a lifetime of love. They faced impossible odds and found a way through. They built a business, raised a family, and left the world better than they found it. It was, by any measure, a life well lived. And it all started with an umbrella, a coat, and the courage to keep walking through the rain.